Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Diamond's mornings in Bridgetown began with the rooster's crow blending into the clatter of her thoughts. The sun didn't rise for her like a warm greeting. It crawled in like an uninvited guest, poking its fingers through the holes in her zinc roof, reminding her that another day had come without change. She lived in a small back room behind Mama Philo's house, where the floor was a patchwork of cracked cement and the walls whispered when the wind passed through their gaps. Each morning, she would sweep the corridor like someone trying to erase yesterday's failures, her broom stirring not just dust, but unspoken dreams. There was no silver spoon in her story. In fact, she often felt like life didn't even offer her a plate. Her siblings had moved on to better towns and louder lives, where their phones rang with purpose and their worries wore perfume. But Diamond? She existed in the background, like the faded curtain that flapped beside her bed, always there, never noticed. She washed clothes for neighbors whose laughter echoed across the walls while her own voice remained a quiet hum inside her chest. And yet, she never cursed the silence. Instead, she wore it like a wrapper, tight, familiar, and oddly comforting. Each naira she earned from errands felt like pulling water from a rock, yet she tucked it away like precious pearls, hoping one day she could buy more than just bread and soap. She had not always known the shape of her own hunger, not the one for food, but the ache for something that felt like a future. That revelation came slowly, like a wound that didn't bleed until pressed. It happened one Tuesday, the kind of afternoon where the clouds were too tired to argue with the sun. Diamond had just returned from washing a pile of bed sheets for a woman named Miss Janice, whose tongue could peel yam. As Diamond scrubbed the last stain, she overheard two girls walking past the gate. "This gown was made by Madame Claire," one said. "She's the best tailor around here." The other giggled, swirling in her neatly sewn dress. Something in Diamond's spirit moved, not with envy, but with recognition. Tailoring. The word wrapped itself around her heart like a measuring tape. It was the first time in a long while that she imagined doing something that wasn't about surviving, but creating. That night, she couldn't sleep. The mosquito net hung above her like a prayer unanswered, and the floor creaked beneath every shift of her restless body. She thought of all the times she had adjusted torn hems and buttoned loose sleeves for free, as if her hands already knew the rhythm of a machine she had never owned. And so, the next morning, as the cock crowed again like a stubborn town crier, Diamond took her first silent vow: she would learn to sew. Not someday, not maybe, but soon. Finding someone to teach her, however, was like looking for water in a basket. Most people wanted money up front, and the little Diamond had saved couldn't even cover half the fee. Days turned into a slow march of disappointments, but she refused to lay her dreams on the altar of discouragement. After asking around like a traveler searching for light in a city of closed lanterns, she met Madame Claire, a woman whose fingers seemed to carry decades of stories stitched into fabric. Claire's shop sat near the Bridgetown roundabout, modest but orderly, smelling of starch and dreams. When Diamond approached her, she expected a sigh, a headshake, maybe even laughter. But Claire simply looked at her, nodded once, and said, "If your hands are willing, my table is open. You'll pay me small, small." That single sentence was the first thread sewn into Diamond's new life. From then on, she woke up before the birds did, her feet kissing the dusty paths as she walked to the shop with a water bottle, a biscuit, and determination packed in her faded tote. Learning was not a stroll in the park. Her fingers fumbled, her back ached, and once a needle pierced her thumb so deep it bled into the fabric. But Claire didn't coddle her. "Even roses bleed before they bloom," she would say. So Diamond stayed, practiced, listened, and stitched her failures into lessons. The days folded into each other like pieces of fabric, and her confidence began to grow in quiet creases. Claire's mentorship was not just about sewing, it was a schooling of the spirit. Diamond learned that patience wasn't just about waiting, it was about how you wait, with grace and grit. Her stitches became straighter, her cutting more precise, and slowly, customers began to trust her small contributions under Claire's guidance. But as her apprenticeship neared its end, a fresh anxiety unfurled in her chest like a crumpled receipt of forgotten debts. She had no machine, no shop, and not a coin to buy a yard of fabric. Her certificate would soon gather dust if nothing changed. So one evening, beneath the orange canopy of a Bridgetown sunset, she did something she had not done in a long time. She picked up her phone and called home. She dialed her mother first. Mama Eugenia answered with a wary tone, the kind people use when they smell a request. Diamond spoke gently, explaining how far she had come and what little she needed to begin. Her mother exhaled long enough to tell a story of her own lack. I would have helped if I had, she said, like a line rehearsed too many times. One by one, Diamond called her siblings. Cindy was struggling with rent. Raymond had bills to pay. Sophia wasn't working at the moment. When the calls ended, Diamond didn't cry. She just sat still, the phone resting on her lap like a stone. The silence wasn't new, but this time it pinched. Not because they said no, but because none of them asked, how are you really doing? Not even once. Diamond had never been the kind to announce her pain, but in the days following those fruitless phone calls, something shifted in her silence. It became heavier, like rain-soaked cloth that wouldn't dry no matter how long the sun sat overhead. Her routine remained the same, her footsteps just as steady, her voice just as quiet, but her spirit had begun to fold in on itself like unused fabric. Bridgetown bustled on, merchants calling out from wooden stalls, children laughing in packs as they ran barefoot through muddy gutters, and life carrying itself forward with or without her dreams. She walked past these scenes each day with her chin raised, but her heart dragging behind like a forgotten shadow. At Madame Claire's shop, she finished her training with quiet excellence. No grand celebration, no applause, just a folded certificate that felt like a folded promise. One evening, after the last customer picked up their blouse and the shop closed its tired eyes, Diamond stood in the center of the room and looked around. It was as if her hands had finally learned to sing, but there was no choir waiting. She turned off the light, locked the door, and whispered a thank you to the walls, to the chair that didn't complain under her weight, and to the sewing machine that had shared her heartbeat for months. Her training had ended, but the road ahead felt like a fabric roll that had no start, just thread unraveling into the unknown. Back home, her small room greeted her with familiar emptiness. The window screeched when pushed open, the bulb flickered like it wasn't sure it wanted to live, and the air inside held the tired scent of someone who had kept too many sighs bottled in. Diamond sat on the edge of her foam mattress and tried to write out a plan on a brown exercise book, one she found under her pillow like a forgotten chapter of her old life. She listed everything she needed: a second-hand sewing machine, a chair, a table, measuring tape, a few tailoring tools, and enough fabric to begin. The numbers danced on the page like mocking spirits. Even if she sold her sandals and starved for 2 weeks, it would barely scratch the surface. She pressed her pen down harder, as if force could create solutions. That night, sleep tiptoed past her door. Instead, her thoughts kept her company, one after the other like unwelcome guests who refused to leave. The next morning, she bathed in cold water that smelled faintly of rust, wore her neatest blouse, and stepped out, not with a clear destination, but with a mind made up. She would work, whatever job she could find, whatever coins she could gather. Her dream would not die in a cupboard while she watched others wear their purpose like freshly ironed clothes. If no one would stretch a hand to lift her, she would stretch her own legs until the earth gave way. She began asking around again, not for tailoring this time, but for work that paid daily, weekly, anything at all. Bridgetown street corners had ears, and soon whispers began to move like wind through market umbrellas. Most people nodded politely, promising to keep her in mind, their eyes saying something else entirely. A few laughed. "You, a tailor, now want to scrub floors?" one said. But Diamond didn't flinch. Her pride had long learned how to sit quietly in the back row while survival took the stage. A week passed, then another. Hunger joined her like an uninvited roommate. One afternoon, while haggling for a small bag of rice, she overheard a woman named Joyce arguing with her house help at a corner stall. Diamond didn't think twice. She stepped forward like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything still to gain. "Ma, I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, iron, fetch water, anything," she said, her voice steady but stripped of any sugar. Joyce studied her with suspicion at first, then asked her name, her background, if she had stolen anything before. Diamond answered every question like a girl being sewn into honesty. By the next morning, she was on Joyce's compound sweeping leaves before the birds finished their chorus. Her new life had begun, not with a ribbon cutting, but with a broom in hand and a belly that growled more than it smiled. Working for Joyce was no walk in the park, but it was better than walking without direction. The woman was sharp-tongued, with a face that rarely smiled and expectations as high as the mango tree in her front yard. Still, Diamond endured. She washed clothes with aching fingers, polished floors till they reflected the ceiling, cooked stews with measured salt, and ironed school uniforms until the creases saluted. The pay was modest but regular, and that was more than she'd had in months. Every time she received her envelope, she hid it beneath her bed in a colo box she had decorated with scraps of Ankara, her quiet reminder of the dream that still lived. She stopped buying soft drinks and stopped visiting her old friends. She no longer followed idle chatter near the stalls or laughed at jokes that cost her time. Every action was calculated, every day folded neatly into the next. As the months passed, the coins in the colo box grew into bundles, and those bundles grew into stacks wrapped in rubber bands. One night, she opened the box and counted it all under the glow of a rechargeable lamp. Her fingers trembled. The total wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to rent a modest space and buy a sewing machine, not brand new, but strong enough to hum her dreams back to life. She knelt on the cold floor and smiled. The silence around her was still loud, but this time it sang a different song, one of small beginnings, of slow, hard-earned joy stitched together by a girl who refused to be forgotten. The morning Diamond opened the wooden door to her shop. The sky wore the kind of gray that hinted at rain but refused to pour. It was as if even the heavens paused to observe the moment. The shop wasn't grand. It stood quietly beside a barber shop and a small canteen, its paint faded in places, and its window laced with dust, but to Diamond it looked like a palace built from stubborn hope. She carried in her sewing machine with both hands, pressing it gently onto the freshly scrubbed table like one might place a crown on a velvet cushion. Her heart thumped in slow, heavy beats, not from fear, but from a strange reverence, like meeting an old friend who had waited years to be embraced. She lit a stick of incense, not out of habit, but to let the scent of beginnings fill the air. A borrowed chair sat behind the machine, its cushion torn at the side, but she patched it with a folded wrapper, humming a quiet tune as her hands worked. The tape rule dangled from her neck like a stethoscope, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe without waiting for anyone's permission. Her first customer that week was a church usher, who brought in 2 faded wrappers and a picture of a style cut from a magazine. Diamond nodded confidently, though inside her chest, her nerves moved like ants scattered from their hill. Still, she stitched. The needle danced, the fabric obeyed, and the sound of the machine filled the small room like laughter returning home. Word of mouth in Bridgetown spread faster than fire on dry harmattan grass. The usher returned with a smile and more wrappers. A young man came for school trousers. Then a mother walked in with her daughter for matching dresses. Diamond's shop slowly grew into a haven, not just for fabric and thread, but for stories, idle gossip, and unspoken struggles. The women who entered her door often stayed longer than they needed to, sipping sachet water while talking about their husbands, their rent issues, their children's school fees. Diamond listened, nodded, smiled, sometimes advised, but never judged. Her fingers moved while her ears worked. Over time, she bought a second stool, then a standing fan, then a small wall clock that ticked with a rhythm that matched her daily grind. She saved every leftover scrap of fabric, not out of stinginess, but because she believed even remnants had purpose, just like her. And though she was busy, she never let herself forget the path she had walked, the cold baths, the unanswered calls, the back-breaking chores. She kept her colo box under the table still, now filled with spare change and folded receipts, each one a breadcrumb on her trail of progress. When she finally felt ready, she reached for her phone with cautious fingers and dialed her mother's number. It had been months since their last real conversation. "Mama, I've opened my shop," she said, voice soft but certain. The silence on the other end was long, not heavy, just uninterested. Our dearest things that they need to make things. What is low when he burns a chenille life your hurenit and say that forces have music planes expressed contradiction to send that is to my music is turned to the things of the hive. The show research for the social how this minutes that it can overlet it what I are. Cover out the line is a thought that there are most news like the server. My thing better for that is started have it that I got that and Belgium and the station, but I think I feel that hard as ever that amazing as they say. And boy, we should make him bang as that and get his off as out. On position, maybe it's making different. God is good, Mama Eugenia said, then quickly changed the topic to fuel prices and mosquito infestations in her compound. Diamond hung up feeling neither full nor empty, just awake. Time moved like an old tailor, slow, precise, deliberate. Diamond's days became a quiet routine stitched with discipline. She swept the shop before sunrise, greeted customers with warmth, mended torn hems, and always gave honest pricing. She didn't hike costs, even when she knew she could, because greed didn't live in her blood. One afternoon, she closed early and walked to the market to buy a new pressing iron, one that didn't spark when plugged in. Her face bore a smile, not the kind that drew attention, but the type worn by someone finally drinking from the well they dug themselves. On her way back, her phone buzzed. It was her mother. "Diamond, I'll beg. I need small money." "I've not eaten since yesterday," the voice said, coated in a mix of accusation and entitlement. Diamond's smile faded slightly, but she didn't hesitate. She transferred what she could. A few days later, it happened again. And again. Each call came wrapped in urgency, sometimes layered with guilt. "So, you opened shop and forgot your mother?" "Other children take care of their parents, but I gave birth to a stone." These words weren't shouted. They were spoken with a sharp calm that cut deeper than rage. Diamond never argued. She said what she could, then returned to her sewing. But inside, a small crack had formed. Not because of the money she could manage, but because her success had turned into a feeding trough for people who never built the barn. She began to notice how her calls to check on them were ignored unless they ended with transfers. Her siblings, they saw her new shop post online, but never reached out. It was as though her struggle had only become worthy now that it served their appetite. One evening, Diamond sat by the door of her shop, watching children play with tires down the narrow path. The sky had turned golden, casting long shadows that danced beside her. She thought of her younger self, the girl who once counted coins for Gary, who begged for a chance to learn, who swept floors and peeled onions with hands blistered from hard water. That girl had crawled so this woman could now stand, yet even standing came with its burdens. Her phone pinged again. A message from her mother. So this is the little money you could send me? No greeting. No question about her health. Just that one line, heavy with unspoken expectations. Diamond read it thrice, then placed the phone beside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt tired, not physically, but in her soul. Like someone walking a long road, only to find out it loops back to the same point. She didn't cry. Her eyes had learned to hold back tears like a dam built of grit. Instead, she stood up, walked into her shop, and began folding fabrics into neat piles. The day wasn't over, and neither was she. But in that moment she made a second silent vow, not to stop giving, but to stop bleeding for those who wouldn't bring even a bandage. Her kindness was a cloth, but even cloths tore when stretched beyond their strength. And so, as the evening breeze swept through the open window, Diamond stitched another outfit beneath a lamp that flickered like her faith, dim, but not defeated. The following weeks melted into one another like wax from a candle that burned at both ends. Diamond still woke early, still tied her scarf with that same firm knot behind her neck, still swept the corridor of her shop with gentle strokes that stirred up more than just dust. But her spirit no longer floated like a kite in the wind. It felt more like a stone tucked in her chest. She had started waking up not just to open her shop, but to brace for the next demand, the next subtle jab dressed in motherly tone, the next moment where her phone vibrated not with love, but with quiet guilt. Every alert made her stomach tighten. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to ignore her mother's calls. It was like asking the sea not to wave. Mama Eugenia's voice had taken on a rhythm, one that no longer bothered with pleasantries. There's no food at home. Your uncle is sick. The rent here is due. You should see what other daughters are doing. And Diamond, though weary, continued sending what she could. Not because she had more than enough, she didn't, but because saying no felt like disowning herself. Her shop barely stayed afloat now. She had stopped stocking new fabrics. Her customers still came, but she had started turning them away when she ran out of zippers, lining, or thread. Once her iron sparked mid-use and ruined a client's dress, forcing her to return half the payment in apology. Even then, she didn't breathe a word of her struggles to anyone. Her pain was a private possession, worn like a necklace hidden beneath her blouse, close to the heart, and kept out of sight. She sometimes sat at the doorway of her shop in the late afternoons, letting the sun brush against her skin, warming the cold ache that had taken up space in her chest. Children still played down the lane. The sound of tire wheels on gravel, the sharp laughter, the clapping games, all reminders that the world kept moving no matter whose heart was breaking in silence. A woman named Chenier, whose fabric Diamond had once sewn free of charge when her son fell ill, walked past with a nylon bag and called out, "Auntie Diamond, you never come my side again, oh." Diamond smiled, waved, and said she'd visit soon. But her voice barely lifted. Even her joy had begun to speak in whispers. She missed laughing without caution. She missed dancing to her small radio without checking her account balance first. She missed the early days of her shop when every corner felt like a prayer answered. Now, even the walls seemed to lean in with concern. Her mirror had cracked, her plastic water dispenser had started leaking, and her measuring tape had faded numbers at the edges. The wear and tear mirrored how she felt inside, functioning, but fraying at the seams. And through it all, her family remained comfortably distant unless her money was involved. Her siblings only remembered her on birthdays or when they heard she had made a customer's dress that stood out at a wedding. They would send messages like, "Big Taylor, you day try, oh," then follow it with a, "Might fit send me $5K till month end," and she would respond with just enough to keep the peace, but never enough to feel whole. One Sunday morning, she stood before her mirror, adjusting a dress she made for herself with leftover fabric. It was a soft lilac piece with gentle pleats and a narrow waist, the kind that made her look like she had somewhere to be, even if she didn't. As she ran the final stitch and looked at her reflection, she paused. The woman staring back at her had tired eyes and shoulders that sloped from bearing too much for too long. She stepped back, picked up her phone, and began scrolling through old messages. There were dozens from her mother, all cut from the same cloth. I need, send, help, but none that asked, how are you? Or do you have enough for yourself? Not even once. Something in her snapped, but not loud like a breaking branch, more like the quiet rip of old fabric. She turned off her phone and left it on the table. That day, she walked to the community chapel and sat in the back row, far from the pulpit, near the open window where the light filtered through like forgiveness. She didn't pray out loud. She didn't cry. She just sat, letting the hush of the room cover her like balm. When the service ended, she walked home slowly, passing by faces she knew and ones she didn't, breathing in a new kind of clarity. That evening, when her mother called again, she didn't pick up. Not out of spite, but out of the need to breathe without asking permission. Days passed, then a week. Her mother called 4 times. Her siblings buzzed her lines with side comments like, "Mama said you're ignoring her, and you're acting somehow these days." But Diamond stayed still. She returned to her shop with new resolve. She bought zippers in bulk, refilled her thread box, repaired her pressing iron, and even repainted the shop door herself using leftover paint a neighbor gave her. She told no one, not even Joyce, who still passed by and waved now and then. Instead, she stitched in silence, reintroducing herself to the joy that came from creating, not for applause or approval, but simply because it fed her spirit. Her customers noticed the change. They complimented her energy, her work, her new firmness with boundaries. She began saying no to ridiculous deadlines and even turned down clients who wanted to pay half now and half never. She smiled more, not the smile of someone trying to please, but the smile of someone who has chosen peace. And slowly, something began to shift. Not outside, but within. Her morning started with music again. Her tea tasted sweeter. Her eyes stopped flinching at phone notifications. And though her mother still sent messages laced with entitlement, Diamond now responded with measured grace, or not at all. She no longer felt guilty for keeping what she earned. For the first time in years, she felt like the thread she had used to sew others' happiness was now stitching her own joy back together, one quiet loop at a time. The quiet strength Diamond now wore did not arrive in one thunderous moment. It settled like dew, quietly claiming every surface of her life until it began to glisten in her walk, her tone, and the way she threaded her needle without shaking hands. There were no banners, no clapping audience, just the soft but firm awakening of a woman who had learned that love without respect was simply emotional theft. Her mother still called, though the frequency had reduced, perhaps sensing the shift, perhaps hoping guilt would once again unlock the faucet of Diamond's kindness. But she no longer jumped at every ring. She had learned that not every knock on the door deserved to be answered, especially when it came from hands that only reached out to take. That afternoon, as she swept the front of her shop and watched a kite soar over the rooftops, pulled by the wild joy of children's laughter, she smiled, not because she was free of pain, but because she was finally free of permission. The breeze tickled her face, and she paused to feel it. In the past, she would have rushed inside, thinking of the next task, the next client. Now, she allowed herself to enjoy the stillness. Her mind wasn't just thinking of money or survival. It was thinking of color combinations, better pricing strategies, and maybe even teaching young girls who couldn't afford formal training. There was room now, not in her wallet, but in her soul. A room where peace sat on a small wooden stool and stretched its legs. She had begun noting small wins in a faded diary she found behind her cupboard. Each page was dated with scribbled gratitude. Customer came back to say the gown fit perfectly. Sold 3 outfits today. Didn't cry after Mama's last message. These entries became her quiet gospel, proof that joy could exist in moments the world overlooked. One day, she got a message from a client she didn't recognize. The woman had seen her work on someone at a wedding and wanted 3 dresses sewn for a birthday party. Diamond asked all the right questions: measurements, color scheme, event location, then quoted her price firmly, no discounts. The woman agreed without hesitation. That night, Diamond worked late under her rechargeable lamp, music playing from her radio in a low hum, her fingers moving in rhythm with each beat. Her shop, though small, had begun to feel like an extension of her body, a place where her hands translated vision into reality. She took breaks now, not out of exhaustion, but intention. She would sit outside on a plastic chair, sip ginger tea, and watch life pass without rushing to catch it. And for the first time in her adult life, her heart wasn't constantly bracing for the next emotional ambush. Her mother's calls became background noise. When she picked, she spoke briefly. When she didn't, she felt no guilt. She was done bleeding from wounds she never caused. Her siblings, sensing the new firmness in her tone, began to withdraw their frequent check-ins that always ended in subtle begging. Sophia stopped sending voice notes that began with "How's business?" and ended with "Please, can I borrow small change?" Raymond reduced his messages to emojis. Cindy posted photos online of beach outings and brunches, never tagging Diamond, but always watching her stories. Diamond noticed the silence, but didn't chase it. She had spent years casting nets into their lives, hoping for something more than fishbones of obligation. Now, she let the water still. It was in this quiet season that she met an older woman named Mummy Ada, who came into the shop one rainy morning with a torn wrapper and a kind smile. She had heard about Diamond through a friend and wanted help resizing some of her old clothes. They talked as Diamond worked, and before long, Mummy Ada began stopping by more often, not always with fabric, sometimes just to sit and chat. She asked Diamond questions no one had bothered to about her dreams, about whether she ate properly, about what made her happy besides sewing. These questions, so simple yet unfamiliar, made Diamond feel seen in a way her own blood had never managed. She didn't overthink it. She just embraced the warmth, the way someone standing too long in rain would naturally lean toward fire. It was during one of their many afternoon chats that Mummy Ada said something that anchored itself in Diamond's heart like a nail in soft wood. "You've given so much of yourself to people who drink from your well, but never ask if your bucket is leaking." Diamond didn't reply immediately. She just nodded, her hands pausing mid-stitch. That evening, she sat with that sentence, holding it like a fragile glass cup. She thought of her mother, of how giving had never felt like love, only duty. She remembered the shame she used to feel when she couldn't send enough, and how it had melted into bitterness when all she got in return was silence or scorn. But now, she was different. She wasn't trying to win approval. She wasn't waiting to be chosen by the people who should have protected her. Her shop had become more than a business, it was her declaration. Every seam, every pattern, every thread was a testimony that she could build something meaningful without needing applause from those who ignored her struggle. As the sky dimmed and thunder rumbled softly in the distance, Diamond lit a small candle, placed it near her diary, and wrote, "Today I did not shrink. I did not chase. I did not bleed. I just lived." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a door, closed but not locked. Diamond had long stopped measuring her worth by the number of bank alerts or the smiles she could squeeze out of people who rarely returned them. Instead, she began to measure it by the peace in her bones, the weight of her laughter, and the calm that greeted her in the mirror. Her shop had grown, not in size, but in soul. It carried the fragrance of dignity, not desperation. Each customer who walked in met a woman who now understood the difference between giving and draining. The walls, once plain and chipped, now bore small handmade frames with soft affirmations in cursive: "You are enough, even quiet roots grow trees, love without burden." The quotes weren't meant to impress anyone. They were reminders to herself, words stitched into her own healing fabric. She now wore colors that suited her, earthy tones and deep maroons that reflected the quiet fire within. Her smiles didn't arrive in haste anymore. They came after thought, after breath, after choice. And that made them real. She had learned to hold space for herself without guilt. Her morning started with warm tea and gospel music in the background, her hands wrapped around her mug like it was the only conversation she needed to have before noon. Her mother still sent messages. Sometimes it was, "I need painkillers and foodstuff." Other times it was just silence that stretched for days, only to return with a guilt-dipped request. But Diamond didn't crumble anymore. She had stopped confusing silence for peace and absence for humility. She responded when she could, kindly but firmly, no longer tethered to the invisible leash of emotional obligation. There was a particular afternoon that sealed this new rhythm in her life. A teenage girl named Amara wandered into her shop, eyes wide with curiosity, fingers nervously picking at her skirt. Diamond looked up from her machine and smiled gently, setting aside the half-sewn blouse in her lap. The girl explained in a voice barely louder than a whisper that she had been watching Diamond for weeks, that she wanted to learn how to sew but had no money and didn't know where to begin. Her story sounded like an echo of Diamond's own beginnings, back when dreams sat on the floor beside hunger and no one saw them. Without asking too many questions, Diamond told her to come the next Monday. "If your hands are willing, I'll teach you," she said, the same words Madame Claire had once spoken to her. That evening, as Diamond swept her shop and thought of Amara's trembling voice, something inside her settled like dust after a long storm. She realized her story wasn't just about escape, it was about returning whole. Returning to the same streets that once knew her as the girl who washed clothes and fetched water, now as someone who had quietly survived. Not survived as a warning to others, but as proof that you could climb a mountain without shouting, that sometimes the loudest power was a soft, persistent step. She wasn't after revenge. She wasn't chasing recognition. She had outgrown both. What she craved now was consistency, calmness, and purpose that didn't come with applause attached. At night, Diamond would sometimes light a single candle, not because there was no electricity, but because she liked the stillness it brought, the way it flickered softly against the walls, casting gentle shadows that danced like memories. She would kneel on her woven mat, whisper a prayer with no long preamble, no grand requests, just gratitude and the strength to remain unbothered by what didn't align with her peace. On one of those nights, she opened her old notebook, the one filled with her earliest plans, price estimates, and scrawled dreams that once felt too big for her small hands. She flipped through each page like one would go through photographs of a childhood long past. There were smudges from tears, broken ink pens, and corners folded from being held too often. She found the very first note she had written at the bottom of the first page, "Sew with faith, even if the cloth is borrowed." She smiled and shook her head, remembering the days she had eaten dry gari and used her last 100 Nigerian nairas to buy thread. Those days no longer haunted her. They informed her. They added weight to her footsteps, shaped her backbone, gave flavor to her victories. She had not only learned how to sew fabric, she had sewn back her confidence, her sense of worth, her ability to sit in her own presence and not feel lacking. She didn't need validation from people who had proven time and again that their love had conditions. Her heart was no longer on clearance sale. Weeks later, Diamond found herself standing outside her shop one golden evening, her arms folded across her chest, watching people pass by with no sense of urgency. Her dress fluttered lightly in the breeze, and from the corner of her eye, she noticed her mother approaching from the far end of the road. It had been nearly a year since they had seen each other face to face. Mama Eugenia walked slowly, as if measuring the steps between them. When she arrived, there was no hug, no dramatic tears, just a simple "I was around. I decided to stop by." Diamond nodded and offered her a seat. They talked about the weather, the price of tomatoes, and neighborhood gossip. But somewhere in the silence between sentences, an apology hung in the air, unspoken but sensed. Her mother's eyes lingered on the shop's neatly arranged shelves, the framed quotes, the polished sewing machine. She touched the edge of the table and said quietly, "You did all this by yourself." Diamond nodded again, her voice even. "Yes, I did." No bitterness. No need to recount who didn't show up or who let her drown. That wasn't the story anymore. When her mother stood to leave, she said, "If you ever need anything," and trailed off. Diamond smiled, not out of sarcasm, but from the peace of someone who finally realized that needing nothing from those who had nothing to give wasn't pride. It was freedom. She walked back into her shop, closed the door, and got back to work, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And that, above all, was the full circle of her healing. Sometimes the most dangerous kind of pain is not the one that screams. It's the one that quietly collects in the corners of your heart while you continue showing up, giving, and smiling. Like Diamond, many of us have poured into others from empty cups, hoping they'd notice our sacrifice, or at least offer a little water in return. But here's a truth you must hold with both hands. Not everyone who drinks from your well will ask if your bucket is leaking. There comes a time in your life when you must stop chasing validation from people who never saw your struggle. Stop calling those who only pick up when they need something. Set boundaries not out of pride, but out of preservation. You cannot heal in the same place that drained you. Learn to choose yourself, not because you are selfish, but because your peace is no longer up for negotiation. Diamond's story is not just about hard work. It's about emotional maturity. It's about knowing when to give, when to walk away, and when to stop explaining your silence to people who never asked about your tears. You owe no one an apology for growing into someone who finally honors their own needs. It's okay to say no and mean it. It's okay to not respond. It's okay to rise without announcing it. Keep your head up. Keep your hands working. Your peace, your progress, your healing, these are not for display. They are your inheritance. Wear them like royalty. And remember, the ones who couldn't clap for you when you were climbing are not the ones you need beside you when you reach the top. Heavenly Father, thank you for the strength to rise, even when the world sat on our shoulders like a load we didn't ask to carry. Thank you for the quiet victories, the ones no one saw but you. Thank you for protecting our hearts when they were misunderstood, taken for granted, and stretched beyond what was fair. Lord, for every listener who has ever given more than they had, for every heart that bled in silence, for every soul that built something beautiful with no applause, may you reward them openly. May you give them wisdom to know when to stop giving to those who only take. May you teach their hearts to say no with boldness and yes with discernment. May they never again trade peace for pity or strength for survival. Lord, surround them with people who pour into them too. Fill their hands with provision, their minds with clarity, and their paths with favor. Let their names be mentioned in rooms where help flows freely, and let their struggles birth testimonies that only you could orchestrate. Where rejection once lived, let honor now dwell. Where guilt used to grow, plant boldness. Where silence once stung, let peace sing like never before. We declare, no more emotional manipulation, no more unnecessary bleeding, no more performing for love. We walk in freedom. We walk in purpose. We walk in peace in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.